One of the most frequently asked questions that I receive about what I do, where do I work, what business are you in? I always anticipate that question. The reason I anticipate it is because I get to tell a story in a sentence that tells not only about everything I do, but about my whole life. And when people ask me, what do you do or where do you work? I always say, I lead a nonprofit called FatherSeekers. What do you do at Father? I work to help restore fatherhood to our fatherless culture. Now, those are words that people don't often hear all together, clustered in one sentence. And then most of the time it's, oh, that's really cool. Or, wow, I've experienced that too. Some of the time there's a puzzle look, and I have to say, I help fatherless fathers and sons become great fathers. That carries it forward. And today, I want to talk to you about what's a father seeker, telling you the story behind the story of why we exist, who we are, and what we want to do. This is Barry with FatherSeekers, and this is the podcast, Teach Me to Father. I want to tell you a little bit about how the whole thing originated, how FatherSeekers really started. I started really in detail deep years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, really focusing on it because I had just finished up a 20-year run in youth ministry. After that, I was a lead pastor in a small church in North Carolina. And one of the things that I kept noticing was the effect of fatherhood, the lack thereof, and the effect of fatherlessness in the culture, in the church, in the kids that I worked with, in the men that I worked with professionally, not only in the church, but as a coach, a spiritual leader in their lives, a spiritual advisor, helping them grab hold of one of the stressors in their life, and that was growing up without a dad. Now, I want to tell you bits and pieces of my life and how that worked out and how it all came to be. When you grow up fatherless, there's a particular characteristic or two that you have about yourself. And one of those characteristics is clearly, because of our great design by God, we all have this one thing called father hunger. There is not one of us on earth that does not have that father hunger. It is wired. It's wired into us. And when you grow up without a dad, because that's the original design, that's the way we were created to have a father who not only raised us properly, but a father who was the direct representation of God himself on earth to their children. So if you grew up without a dad, the second characteristic is, after father hunger, is you have an issue with approaching God because he was first introduced to you, as was me, as father. Now, you may push back on that and you may say, no, I don't have a problem with that, but let's dig a little deeper. Because one of the truest facts, one of the most obvious facts, is that when a guy grows up fatherless or a lady grows up fatherless, the ladies tend to have problems in their relationships with men, and some choose the wrong kind of man. If I've heard that story once, I've heard hundreds of times, literally. But when men grow up, they, without a dad, whatever the reason for fatherlessness, they can push through, they can grow through it, they can become certain things, but still yet there's this glaring characteristic of father hunger. Now, when that really flares and when that really amplifies, like it did with me, is soon after I got married, my children came along. And boy, was that the moment that my fatherlessness flared, I literally had no idea. I had not a clue. And one of the problems with that is that fathers give their children identity and mothers give their children emotional health. And if we don't, as a man, as a human, but particularly men, if we don't have an understanding of what our identity is, we will go off track really quick, and we will begin to create patterns of in our lives of not only being in discomfort and dysfunction because we know something's wrong. We know that in fact something is not right, and we know something is not fitting well. And then we begin to understand and notice the dysfunction as it rises in our behavior and our thinking and our processing, regardless of the age, but especially when we get married and have children. Then there's a distortion of reality because we know something's missing. And then there's this huge disorientation because we don't have a pathway. And for me, I got stuck. I got stuck in insecurity, inferiority, indecision, and it was so difficult for me. The adjustments that I made were not helpful adjustments because I did them from my perspective and my own understanding, which if the original design is God, God passes everything down from father to son, and you don't have a father, then there's a missing link. So with that being said, it's like us putting together a puzzle that is thousands of pieces without any help and having pieces missing. There'll always be a part of the picture missing. And that's what I want to talk to you about. How do we make sense to fill in the blanks, to create narratives that will explain to us what's happening, to understand the absences in our lives, because there are lots. Not just our fathers obviously were absent for whatever reason, and that's a whole different podcast. But what are the absent things? One of the first things is answers. Answers are absent. One of the first answers I encountered was, well, why did my dad leave literally in the middle of the night and we were unable to locate him for months? Why did he do that? The next question is, of course, where is he? Where did he go? Who is he with? Why is he gone? And then the third question always comes, is it my fault? What did I do? What happened? Am I responsible? Am I the thing? Am I the reason that something happened? One of the things that we have to really consider when we get to this stage and we begin to examine the narratives that we've created over time, especially when we're young, especially when we were young children, elementary, junior high, high school, when we begin to build those narratives to try to understand, because that's what the natural mind does. It is geared and designed to try to fill in the blanks, to get answers, to create narratives, to make us whole, to help us understand, and make sense of the absence. But also, when we are dealing with emotions and feelings, we get conflicted with what's known and unknown in that narrative creation. And then our emotions begin to play and our feelings begin to play. And there is a huge, huge issue of confusion and frustration and anger and anxiety, and hurt implodes, and identity deficits flare. And we're confused, we're distracted, we are disrupted, Our hearts and minds are literally being destroyed by what we don't know, but our minds are seeking out the answer to this father hunger question. God placed the father hunger in us. That's his design. That's that's the way he created it. That's the way he built it in. That's what he did so that we would know who he is through our earthly fathers who we know and understand God by and through. See, when we begin to understand the whole father hunger picture, there are things that come into play that will help us identify these absences. And these absences not only our father clearly, but here are some of the other things that are absent that come into play that have a direct effect on us as men, on us as fathers, and on us as key influences and figures that will affect the next generation being through our children. One of those things that is clearly absent is the proper fathering from our earthly biological fathers. Now, I know all of our stories are different and everything shakes out, but with some similar variables and some similarities, I want to draw this conclusion from the issue of father hunger that our fathers were designed by God to be the representation of God to us on the earth. When we begin to understand that that's how not only being a good son is part of being a good father, but it is also understanding that God himself designed us this way. And it's important for us to understand and move forward that for us not having proper fathering, that we have to have that issue addressed or we will pass forward to our kids our inabilities, our insecurities, our inferiorities, our issues, our problems. We will pass those forward, and then the next generation will have to deal with those. One of the other things that's absent is the identity. I mentioned it just a moment ago, but we get our identity from our fathers, but we get our emotional health from our mothers. Now, let that equation sink for just a second. Let it drop to the bottom. If our identity comes from our father, and that's designed by God, and our father is absent for whatever reason, clearly we have to acknowledge that we're going to have identity issues and they must be addressed. They must be rectified. There must be a reckoning with that for us to understand who we really are. The other thing that is crucial to understand is that in absence is the bestowal of manhood upon a boy. Only a father can do that. A father bestows manhood on his son. But manhood is not only bestowed by the father, but also by men in a community of faith or a community of men who recognize you. But none of that can happen. The bestowal of manhood, none of that can happen until our Father bestows that upon us. So if you're missing that, if you miss that like me, then here's part of that battle that we'll have to address, and that is we have to relearn some things at whatever age we are, how that properly was designed, how that properly fits together, and go back and retrofit our hearts and minds to get our hearts and minds retrofitted to original design so that that original design can move forward, that we are good fathers, we are good men, and that we understand who we are in the grand scheme of things and who God created us to be. Now here's the upside and the downside depending on how you look at it. Fatherhood is it's always paid forward. It does not matter It does not matter which way we are trying to work this deal. Fatherhood by default is always paid forward. The question, because fatherhood by nature and default is paid forward, we have to begin to recognize, okay, what is it in me that I'm paying forward to my kids? What is it in me that I'm paying forward to my family? What is it in me that, as a man in the community, what am I paying forward? Do I have a full and complete understanding of what it means to not only be a good father, but to be a good man, a good husband, a good person in community with my brothers? And let me just insert here, if you know me, I will say this in every conversation: you will never be able to do it alone. And if you do not have somebody to walk with who you consider, 3 to 5 guys who you consider to be your brothers, who you can trust, who you can walk with, and those guys will love you and hold you accountable and help you become the man you need to be, then you are hurting yourself. You're setting yourself back. Because we grew up the way we did, and because our fathers abandoned us, or whatever way that you became fatherless, we are recipients of that, what our fathers experienced being paid forward into our lives. That's natural order. So whatever we are, whoever we are, that's who we'll become, and that's what we'll pay forward to our kids. And what I want to drive home with you in this moment is that we have to change. We have to change the culture in our mind, in our heart. We have to break the cycle in our family tree. We have to change the culture in which we live, because if we do not, we are creating more of a fatherless culture that will amplify in future generations. There has to be a generational shift, and it is upon us to do that. We have to choose to do the work to be part of that shift, and it first starts in our own hearts, in our own minds, in our own understanding, in our own study, in our own pursuit, in our own learning from other men how to be a good man, how to be a good dad. You're probably a little better at it than you give yourself credit for, or you may be like me. You had no idea, and you made more mistakes than you did success. Maybe you're like me. Maybe you worked so hard to prove yourself that you overlooked your family. Maybe you worked so hard, or you're doing that now to give your kids things you didn't have, because you're trying to prove yourself or fill a void, a father hunger void. It will never be filled by work or busyness. Perhaps you have a vice or vices that are controlling and driving you to do things that you don't want to do, yet you do them. And yet they're devastating you. They're devastating your family. They're devastating your children. Perhaps they're devastating your career. Here's the truth of the matter. If you're like me, you're a father seeker. And our Father that we first must seek is God in heaven. Not only does he love us, but he has a plan for us and a particular and special design that he's placed in us. Now, you are saying, maybe like I did the first time I heard this, there is no way. He wants nothing to do with me. That was that abandonment and hurt and wound, that father wound that I had coming out. And I rejected God. I was close. I went to church. I loved God. I worshiped, but I didn't pursue him as a father. Maybe you're like me. Maybe that's what's going on with you. Fathers need a continuous feed of encouragement. They need to have value. They need to have resources that will help them not only be encouraged, but get equipped and to get empowered. I want to invite you to go to fatherseekers.org/ Father Fuel, one word. FatherSeekers.org/Father Fuel. It's a weekly resource that comes to you via email. You sign up for it, you get it, and there are 4 or 5 pieces of information, quick, accurate, to the point, one quick read. You can go in and dig a little deeper, but we want to encourage you. We want to give you resources, and we want to give you the ability to empower yourself to become a better father with concepts and tools that strengthen your fatherhood IQ. This is Barry with FatherSeekers, and this is the podcast, Teaching Me to Father. Never, never, never give up. You can do this.